Hi everyone, welcome to another video from Hawkes' History. We're continuing our focus on the AQA Paper 1 Section B, the depth study, which is again conflict and tension between East and West, 1945 to 1972, and again this is a section of the Cold War. Okay, so today's video moves on now from the first part we looked at in the last few videos, which was the origins of the Cold War. Part 2 is the developments of the Cold War. And the first few videos in this section are all going to focus around this topic of the Cold War in Asia. This video's focus is on China, in particular regarding Asia, and this is video 6. Okay, so some background information for China. There had been a civil war in China for many years before World War II, fought between the nationalists, who was led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, led by Mao Zedong. They come together in World War II to defend their homeland when the Japanese invaded. It was an uneasy alliance, however, because remember they had been fighting together previously. So they fought against each other, now they were fighting against a common enemy, but after World War II happened, they no longer had a common enemy to fight. A bit like with the Big Three in Europe, after Hitler was defeated, they no longer had a common enemy, so they started to turn on each other. After World War II, the nationalists took control, who were led by Chiang Kai-shek. His government was very corrupt, and people in the everyday China were starving and were relatively unhappy and unlucky under his regime. The civil war therefore continued after World War II. A brief pause in the middle, and after World War II carried on again. Okay, so how did China fall to communism? The civil war, as you said, continued after World War II, but the communists were very clever. They fed and treated the people. So if you remember, people were starving because of the corrupt nature of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government. The communists, to try and get popular support from the people, fed and treated those who were starving, those who were ill, and therefore as a party they became very popular. They increased in popularity and increased in sort of familiarity as well, so people were more happy for them to become a government because they recognised them and they liked what they were doing. The nationalists begin to realise they are losing, and they retreat to Taiwan, which is an island off of mainland China. They had been supported by the USA, which is interesting. However, Chiang Kai-shek had been taking lots of the US financial aid for himself, which is called embezzlement. So therefore, because of this embezzlement, he had been taking a lot of that aid he was supposed to be giving to his people and his army to fight the communists, but it was no longer happening because he was taking it for himself. And therefore, because of all of this, the communists win in 1949, led by Mao Zedong, and they become, as a result, the Communist Party in power, which becomes eventually the People's Republic of China. So what were the key consequences of China's fall to communism? Truman was accused of having lost China. It's important to remember this was a time in America when there was a real fear of communists infiltrating the government and society. It was called the Red Scare. Now many believed, who we will look at in another video, a man called McCarthy, who set up something called the McCarthy witch hunts, or McCarthyism. He blamed the government, and he felt there were communists in the government who were making it sort of soft on communism, and therefore, as a result of this, Truman and his administration was called weak and faced a heavy deal of pressure from Congress and other members of sort of high American society who felt they were not doing what was needed to deal with the communist threat. Other consequences on a more larger scale was there was clear limitations to their policy of containment. They had given money to the nationalists, but the communists had still won. Now, a reason for this, obviously, was the Chinese were taking the money for themselves, and therefore, even though the Americans were giving aid, they weren't getting all that aid into the army, and therefore they weren't able to use it all. But nevertheless, it is important to consider perhaps containment wasn't necessarily the best policy. There were perhaps flaws with the policy of containment, as even though the USA were giving aid and were trying to actually help the nationalists, they still couldn't prevent communism taking over in China. Communism was also now in Asia, and the US were fearful because of this, as remember they had an interest in Japan. Remember, after World War II, the Americans had taken over Japan, and they had taken that without any help from the Soviets because they had used the atomic bomb. So they were now trying to rebuild Japan and have it as an ally in Asia. But with communism in China, there was fear that this could perhaps spread to Japan, which was a real threat to the American position there. So what were the further consequences? We've looked at the consequences from the Western point of view, and we're now going to look at the consequences from an Eastern point of view. And largely the positive consequences for the East were this idea of Mao now allying with Stalin. So first of all, the USA saw the USSR and China as a monolithic block of communism. And what this means is that USA saw USSR and China, you can see the map, as one big ally. They were connected by ideology, they were connected by, in the future years, a huge treaty as well. Therefore, they saw the communism in both countries as very similar, and therefore that Mao was very obedient to Stalin. They almost sort of saw China as a part of the communist empire that Stalin dominated. However, it becomes increasingly clear throughout the Cold War, and especially looking back on the Cold War as well, that China's communism and the Soviet communism was very different. And it's an incorrect assumption now to make that they were a monolithic bloc, because there were many differences between the two, and they weren't just one sort of solid mass of communism ruled by Moscow. There was much difference between the two, and Stalin had some influence over Mao, but Mao had his own influence over his own country, as well. It wasn't a satellite state like it was in Eastern Europe. The biggest country by population was now communist as well. As you can see, the yellow picture at the bottom underneath the pink Soviet Union doesn't look like a massive country compared to the Soviet Union, but by how many people there were in it, it was the biggest country in the world, and therefore having such a large country under the influence of communism was a massive worry for the Americans. And you can see here the reason why the Soviets and the Chinese were thought was a monolithic block of communism, so as you can see by the blue circle, that if the Americans looked at the map, they would have just seen a massive communist sort of block, as it was, of communism rather than two separate states. You understand it was just playing into their fears a bit. So why did the Cold War get colder? This is an inquiry question AQA posed on their website, and we will look at this in more detail in the next few videos, and I will create another revision map for you regarding this question for you to use at home. The way I've defined colder in terms of the Cold War is increasingly tense relations, and therefore this is seen because China's fall to communism, remember, saw an increasingly communist influence in Asia, and because of this it threatened the American position in Japan, and sort of began to see the start of a future domino theory, because China's fall to communism could see others fall to communism. This wasn't really formalised as a theory until Eisenhower mentions it in his speech in 1954, but we can see the origins of this theory emerging with the fall to communism of China. Secondly, we can see the USA had supported the nationalists in the Civil War, and Stalin had supported the communists in the Civil War. So by supporting opposing sides, it's becoming clear that East and West were now very firmly separated. They were no longer allies, they were firmly enemies, they were supporting different causes. And finally, Truman was called weak by people in America, especially McCarthy, and because of this pressure from America and members of the Congress and the senators, there was an increasing focus on Asia. It became what was known as an Asia First policy, and this develops dramatically over the course of China's fall to communism, and increases much due to the parts of the Korean War. So we will see an increasingly Asia First policy develop as we look through the next few videos.